Russia, of course, is a much weaker power than it was, during the Soviet Union, for example. Soviet Union was a superpower, even though its economy was not as strong as the United States. But Soviet Union was, a superpower, at least in military and security terms. But today's Russia, President Putin's Russia, is a much weaker power. Militarily, yes, it still has nuclear weapons and thousands of nuclear warheads. But economically, Russia today is, the size of the Russian economy today is 1/10 that of China. There was a time in the 1950s when Soviet Union was the big brother. China was the younger brother. When Chairman Mao came to power in 1949, one of the first things he did was to jump on a train and go to Moscow to negotiate a package of aid. He spent nearly 2 months in Moscow negotiating a package of economic assistance from the Soviet Union. And China did see Soviet Union as a model. It saw Soviet Union as the big brother. But I don't think the Chinese see Russia as a big brother anymore. In fact, China has become the big brother.
Thank you, Dr. Taneja, for accepting our invitation to participate in this interview. Much appreciated. When you think of India in the eyes of the world, what are the 2 or 3 words that jump to your mind?
The 2 or 3 words, one could say rising, confident, confronting. I think they basically sum up,
Okay. And when you think of Mr. Modi as a person and as a prime minister, what are the few words that jump to your mind?
Mr. Modi, marketing genius, determined, focused, authoritative.
Okay, thank you. And we can't look at the present and the future unless we look at the past. So let's compare the foreign policy record of India under different governments. So when you compare the India's international and foreign policy record from the 10-year tenure of the UPA government from 2004 to 2014, what is your assessment of that UPA government record?
I think the UPA government, coming to power in 2004 and being led by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who was the pioneer of India's economic reforms as finance minister in 1991, was quite focused on economy, on opening up India's economy, on growing India's economy. And I think foreign policy is essentially an extension of domestic policy. And domestically, India had realized by 2004, in fact, earlier in the 1991 reforms may have been motivated by a crisis, by the balance of payments crisis, But in reality, there was also a realization that India's next door neighbor, China, had had initiated their economic reforms much earlier and was in a much stronger position, much better position economically. So partly, I think India's economic pace picked up when the Manmohan Singh government came to power. The UPA government came to power in 2004. And its focus was on developing the economy, on growing the economy. And I think foreign policy changed accordingly. So the Manmohan Singh government was responding to two things. One, the demands for India to grow its economy rapidly, because if India's economy was not growing fast, it will be left behind even further, behind China. So there was a realization that India needed to develop its economy, but also not just because of China, but also to meet the aspirations of the people of India. Having democracy is one thing, operating in a democratic system is one thing, but democracy also demands that you meet the aspirations of the people. And India's people, with a very youthful population, wanted Indian government to deliver economic growth, to deliver improvements in living standards. And I think the UPA government began in 2004 with that focus, which was reflected in India's foreign policy. So, for example, one of the initiatives taken during that period was this, although it had started earlier, much earlier, but the focus on developing closer relations with East Asian countries. East Asian countries were obviously, growing very fast for many decades. Before that, countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, many other countries in ASEAN, and of course China since the late 1970s. So the UPA government adopted a policy of, really accelerating ties with the countries to the east of India under the Look East policy. And also it began to develop closer relations with the United States. Because remember, the first Indian prime minister to receive a major state dinner in the White House was Manmohan Singh under President Bush, Bush Jr. And that sent very clear signals that the United States was willing to do business with India. It was willing to draw closer to India. And Manmohan Singh government responded to that. The UPA government responded to that. And we saw, for example, the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement come out of that. The BJP government, BJP as such, opposed it at the time. It had its own, objections to it. But that agreement with the United States, even though it may not have contributed much to nuclear energy in India, we haven't seen too many new nuclear power plants, come on stream with the United States' help. But the fact that that agreement was reached, which recognized India's status as a nuclear weapon state, unofficially at least. It acknowledged that India was a nuclear weapon state. And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh at the time, I think, put his own job on the line by taking it to Parliament and ultimately getting the Parliament's approval for that civil nuclear deal. So that was the beginning of India's realignment of India's foreign policy, developing closer ties with countries in East Asia, but also developing.
Okay. Now, as far as the man on the street is concerned, security is of utmost importance. And during the UPA government, there was an attack on the Parliament. There was Mumbai terror attacks. And the perception was that nothing much was done. In fact, the government was impotent, to put it pretty crudely. So compared to that kind of a perception, how do people see Modi government's, the strongman tactics that have been adopted and that have gone very well in the minds of the common public?
Yeah, I mean, under the Prime Minister Modi's government, under the NDA government, we have seen a stronger focus on security, stronger focus, more muscular security policy, both internally and externally. In terms of India's foreign policy, India has taken steps, for example, to deal with the threat of terrorism coming from Pakistan, and generally the security situation has been better managed, I think. Internal security situation has been better managed. Some would argue that perhaps there is too much security, internally, that there's too strong a focus on security at the cost of perhaps human rights. But certainly, this is a government which has been much more focused on security, both internal.
Okay. Now, some analysts have suggested that the West's interest in India stems from viewing India as a political and security counterbalance to China. So, do you believe India is being seen as a pawn in the superpower strategic rivalry?
No, I won't say India is used as a pawn, but the attempts to develop closer relationship with India, as I said, they began much before Prime Minister Modi came to power, because in the West, in the United States, there has been a realization for nearly 2 decades now. In fact, going back to President Obama's time, you might remember President Obama's foreign policy when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State was to pivot to Asia. And a part of the pivot to Asia was to also develop closer relations with India. But I think there's a realization that India is a big country. India now has overtaken China, of course, in terms of population. But India is a country which has one of the biggest militaries, one of the biggest armies in the world. It is a country which has a long border, a 3,500 kilometer long border with China. And it is a country which has an interest in defending its interest vis-a-vis China. And China has emerged as a major foreign policy challenge for the United States and the West in general. So there was a recognition that India was a country which, in fact, India was the only country in Asia which could provide the heft which was needed to counterbalance China. And that's why I think the United States began to make approaches to India during the UPA government, and they have continued under Prime Minister Modi's government. So it's not so much that India is a pawn. I don't think the West or the United States sees India as a pawn, but it sees India as an indispensable partner. That India is an indispensable partner if the United States and the West in general are to contend with China's assertiveness, China's.
Okay. Now, at the recent Raisina dialogues, Dr. Jaishankar, foreign minister, suggested that it's not Russia but China that the West needs to focus its attention on, because that's the country that is most guilty in terms of violating the rules of the global order. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes. I mean, Russia, of course, is a much weaker power than it was, during the Soviet Union, for example. Soviet Union was a superpower, even though its economy was not as strong as the United States. But Soviet Union was, a superpower, at least in military and security terms. But today's Russia, President Putin's Russia, is a much weaker power. Militarily, yes, it still has nuclear weapons, thousands of nuclear warheads. But economically, Russia today is, the size of the Russian economy today is 1/10 that of China. There was a time in the 1950s when Soviet Union was the big brother, China was the younger brother. When Chairman Mao came to power in 1949, one of the first things he did was to jump on a train and go to Moscow to negotiate a package of aid. He spent nearly 2 months in Moscow negotiating a package of economic assistance from the Soviet Union. And China did see Soviet Union as a model. It saw Soviet Union, as the big brother. But I don't think the Chinese see Russia as a big brother anymore. In fact, China has become the big brother. And the challenge for President Putin is to manage that relationship. So Russia and China have become very close. But it is largely because of what Russia needs. Russia needs friends and allies. Russia needs trade partners. Russia needs even military assistance, as we've seen during this war against Ukraine. So I would agree with that description by Dr. Jaishankar, that it's not Russia. Of course, India has a long-standing relationship with Russia, and it will continue. But India's major challenge is China. And I think the United States' major challenge is China today. And this is why we have seen a shift in American foreign policy in being willing to develop closer foreign policy, closer relations with India, despite differences. I mean, there are significant differences between India and the United States, but despite differences, United States is now much more willing to engage with India, to work with India, and to accept that there will be differences.
Okay. Let's go back a bit to India's independence in 1947. Recently, there has been quite a bit of commentary around how Mr. Nehru, gave away the UN Security Council membership to China and mishandled the China War in 1962. So, what's your analysis of that historical account just after independence?
Historically, there is no evidence to suggest that India was given a United Nations Security Council membership on a platter and India turned it down. There was never such an offer. There's a lot of false narratives that have been built that the United States offered Security Council membership to India, but Nehru gave it to China. That is absolutely wrong. China, of course, the Republic of China was one of the founding members of the United Nations Security Council. The Republic of China, which is Chiang Kai-shek's China, became a member of the United Nations, and the United States at the time, which was obviously instrumental in the creation of the United Nations, saw China, Chiang Kai-shek's China at the time, as the only real partner in Asia. Japan, of course, was an enemy. Japan had been defeated in 1945. India was still a British colony. And if Britain was going to be a permanent member of the Security Council, there was no room for India at that time. And Chiang Kai-shek's China was United States ally. And United States therefore chose China, the Republic of China, to be a permanent member of the Security Council. Of course, after 1949, when the Communist Party came to power, the Republic of China moved to Taiwan, and it was a much smaller entity. And it continued to occupy that position in the Security Council as China's true representative. But of course, by the 1950s, it became very clear that there was no chance of Chiang Kai-shek ever taking over China again, and that the communist government was there to stay. And by 1971, China was readmitted. China was admitted to the United Nations. In other words, China was always there, but earlier the United Nations had recognized the Republic of China. In 1971, it kicked Taiwan out, and it accepted that the People's Republic of China was the real China, and it gave that membership to China. So historically, really, there was never any, an offer on a platter to India that, okay, here it is, a permanent, Security Council membership that you can take. Yes, it is true that Prime Minister Nehru he championed, India under Prime Minister Nehru championed that China's seat at the United Nations should be given to the People's Republic of China, to Communist China. He did maintain that position on a matter of principle. On a matter of principle that China was the government which was recognized by most governments. Most of the developing countries, of course, recognized People's Republic of China. And India was one of the first countries to recognize the communist government in Beijing. So Prime Minister Nehru maintained that China was the legitimate government, or the Communist Party government was the legitimate government of China, and therefore People's Republic of China was the legitimate, power for China. And he campaigned in the United Nations for.
Okay. Now, one would assume that with that kind of a friendly overture, the relations would have improved, but it only turned for the worse. Do you think India giving shelter to Dalai Lama was the pivotal moment when China, turned against India?
Well, certainly the arrival of Dalai Lama in India did create problems for Prime Minister Nehru's government. China and the People's Liberation Army, of course, had moved into Tibet in 1950, but it was not until 1959 when His Holiness the Dalai Lama turned up on India's borders. And Prime Minister Nehru's government, based on the fact that he was a religious leader, based on the fact that Indians respected the Dalai Lama, and of course, based on the fact that Buddhism, is a religion which is one of the three great religions born in India. So Prime Minister Nehru's government decided to give shelter to the Dalai Lama in India. And China, of course, was not happy and hasn't been happy ever since Dalai Lama came to India. And later on, of course, the Dalai Lama and his associates established the Tibetan government in exile. The Indian government doesn't recognize the Tibetan government in exile because it recognizes, China, and it does recognize, particularly when the Prime Minister Vajpayee went to China in 2003, he made a very explicit statement, as part of the joint statement that was issued at the end of his visit to China, that India very explicitly recognized Tibet as part of China. Before that, before 2003, India's position on Tibet was open to interpretation. But in 2003, when Prime Minister Vajpayee went to China, he wanted his visit to be seen as a success. And right at the end of his visit, he was kind of tricked into a situation where he signed on to a statement where India explicitly recognized Tibet as part of People's Republic of China. So we have to understand that Tibet has been a key factor in a Sino-Indian relationship. China remains very suspicious of India in terms of how India uses the Tibet card, and certainly in terms of diplomatic games, Dalai Lama's presence in India, while it complicates situation for India in terms of Sino-Indian relations, but it also does give India a very important diplomatic card.
Okay. Now, undoubtedly, China has been the biggest challenge to the Modi government in managing international relations. So, in your assessment, what has gone right and what has gone wrong in this relationship?
Well, if we take what's gone right in terms of things which are beneficial to India, it's trade between China and India, despite all the challenges on the line of actual control on the border, despite the diplomatic difficulties between China and India. Trade between India and China is booming. In 2023, India-China trade was $136 billion US dollars. It continued to grow, and that's largely because Indian companies import components, products which they need for Indian industry to produce various kinds of products, particularly electronics, computers. And therefore, India-China trade has continued to grow large, not because Indian companies or Indian government like China. Trade has continued to grow because Indian companies find China to be a reliable supplier, a very cost-efficient supplier of many of the inputs they need for India's own industrialization, for India to develop its own industries, even for India to become Atmanirbhar, to become self-sufficient. India needs inputs which China is able to supply at a much lower cost, say, than countries like Japan or South Korea. So in terms of what's gone well, I think the trade relationship is seen as beneficial, but a lot of things have also gone wrong. For example, when Prime Minister Modi first came to power, his approach to China was that, because remember, he was one of the first Indian leaders who had never been a member of parliament. He became a member of parliament and immediately became Prime Minister of India. But before that, he had been a state chief minister. Very few state chief ministers have been prime ministers in India. And Prime Minister Modi was chief minister of Gujarat. When he was chief minister of Gujarat, he visited China multiple times. And he was very fond of China's development. He talked very positively about learning from China. And he was impressed by China's infrastructure development. So when he became prime minister, he did attempt to improve relations, perhaps even try to solve the border problem. And you may remember one of the more lasting images of India-China relations is Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping sitting on a swing, on a jhula, on the banks of the Sabarmati River during Xi Jinping's visit to India. So in terms of images, in terms of, diplomatic images, that is perhaps the closest we can get to a good relationship. And Prime Minister Modi attempted, perhaps misguidedly in my view, to develop this close relationship with President Xi Jinping because he believed that if he can develop a good chemistry with the Chinese leader, he could solve some of the long-term problems between China and India. And unfortunately, this is not how China saw it. China had a much more hardline position on the border dispute, on the situation along the line of actual control. Despite all the positivity in the relationship in terms of bilateral visits, President Xi Jinping coming to Ahmedabad and before coming to Delhi, then again on another visit coming to Madras, to Tamil Nadu, and Prime Minister Modi going to Xi'an, which is the home province for President Xi Jinping. He spent a fair bit of time there. And President Xi Jinping made an unusual sort of move to go to Xi'an to welcome Prime Minister Modi. And this is something that Chinese leaders don't usually do, right? So there was signaling from both sides that they were keen to develop diplomatic relationship. But I think the expectations on the Indian side might have been greater, that this could lead to a much more positive political relationship. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. If you remember, when President Xi Jinping was in India on one of his visits to India, we had a border clash between Indian and Chinese forces right when he was in India. So the Chinese have always maintained a very hardline position on the border. And Chinese have a much more systematic approach to dealing with their foreign interlocutors. And India was no exception. But I think India's approach overall, since particularly the 2020 border clash, has been good. I think Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister Jaishankar, the way they have responded to the 2020 clashes and the situation on the border after that has been good in the sense that they have said that, look, the situation is not normal. The situation on the line of actual control is not normal, and therefore we cannot have normal relations between China and India because the situation is not normal. Okay. Because China has changed the status quo on the border. China has definitely changed the status quo on the border, and Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar has maintained that we cannot have normal relations until the situation on the border is normal. But it was complicated by conflicting messages from the Indian government. Conflicting messages in the sense that, on the one hand, Foreign Minister has maintained both in his discussions with the Chinese leaders and in multilateral forums, in think tanks where he's appeared, he's maintained that situation is not normal. What does not normal mean? Does it mean that China is occupying parts of territory claimed by India? If that is the case, then the messaging has been confusing because Prime Minister Modi went on television. I mean, he addressed in front of television cameras and he said, nobody has come into Indian territory. In other words, that, nobody is occupying Indian territory, that China is not occupying any Indian territory. So on the one hand, we have Prime Minister's message that nobody has come in, nobody is occupying Indian territory. On the other hand, we have Foreign Minister who says situation is not normal. And this, I think, for the international audiences, this has been confusing. What is the true situation? Has China occupied territory claimed by India? Or this is not a problem. So if this is not a problem, what is the problem? Why?
Okay. Now, if that is the problem, that India has ceded territory to China, what would be the approach that the opposition, which keeps alleging that we have ceded territory, would adopt? In case the opposition comes to power, in this kind of a delicate situation, what would the opposition do, or what would any other alternative be by any other government?
Well, it would really depend on the situation at the time. I mean, first of all, I don't see any prospects of opposition winning the next election. So opposition having to deal with the China relationship over the next 5 years doesn't seem to be a very realistic possibility at this stage. So in 5 years' time or 5 years later, what the situation is in terms of China and the bilateral relationship, it's difficult to say. It's a hypothetical question. But it is possible that China, because China's economy is now slowing, with very serious consequences for China's long-term growth prospect. There is a real possibility the Chinese economy could go into stagnation, that like Japan in the 1990s, 80s and 90s, that China could follow the Japanese example and go into stagnation. Chinese economy could potentially get stuck with zero growth for a decade. And if that happens, I think China's attitude to India would change too, because part of the arrogance that we've seen in China's security policy is a function of China's economic success. But if the Chinese economy is not doing so well, I think China may be more conciliatory in its relations with India. So 5 years is a long time in politics,
Okay.
and it's difficult to say what any government would do. But my recommendation for any government in India, the Modi government or any future government in India, is that for the next 20, 25 years at least, India should focus on economic growth. India should focus on economic development. India's GDP needs to rise. Simply saying that we are going to be the third largest economy is not enough. India has to. If India is to contend with China, the only way to contend with China really is to develop its economy so that the gap between China and India narrows, and narrows considerably. So the focus has to be on single-mindedly developing Indian economy. India's foreign policy has to be geared towards India's economic development. That has to be the number one priority for Indian foreign policy. Develop your economy. As Bill Clinton used to say, it's the economy, stupid. Economy has to be the focus. And in fact, China followed the same policy. When Deng Xiaoping emerged as the paramount leader of China in the late 1970s, he adopted a policy of developing better relations with every country, with the United States, with Japan. Japan, of course, had been a traditional enemy of China, but he also developed closer relationship with Japan. He tried to improve relations with India. But the reason was that he said China needs to hide its strength and bide time. Keep a low profile. Develop your economy. Once your economy is stronger, you can also modernize your military. If you have a bigger economy, you'll have a bigger military, a more modern military. If you have a stronger industrial base, you will have a stronger military industrial base also, and you'll be a much bigger power. It's only in the last 10 years, since Xi Jinping came to power, that we have seen overt, arrogant sort of attitude from China. But India needs to really take a leaf out of China's book and focus single-mindedly on the economy without creating domestic divisions in Indian society. Because if Indian society is polarized, then it is going to be difficult for India to stay on that steady course.
Okay. Now, one of the former Indian diplomats has said that when it comes to China, distrust more and verify even more. Do you agree with that assessment?
Sorry, say it again. Can you repeat that quote?
When it comes to dealing with China, distrust more and verify even more. It's coined around the Western adage of trust but verify.
Yeah.
But when it comes to China, distrust more and verify even more.
Yeah. It's an old quote from Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. And I think in China's case, China-India relationship, the truth is that ever since the 1962 war, in fact, since the late 1950s, during those repeated visits that Zhou Enlai made to India, it became clear that there was very little trust between India and China. In foreign policy, trust is a scarce commodity. in international relations, trust is a scarce commodity. Nations don't really trust each other. They trust their interests. They have long-term interests, and they pursue their interests. And in India's case, I think the same thing applies. India-China relationship, the same rule applies. They have trust, may or may not exist, but you have to be clear-eyed about where your interests lie. And you need to be very clear about your position on various issues, including the border issue. So trust is not what this relationship is based on. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Trust has been, whatever trust existed between China and India was broken in 2020. Because remember, for nearly 45 years, Sino-Indian border had remained largely peaceful. Peaceful in the sense that nobody had been killed. No bullet was fired in anger, which led to fatalities. For the first time in 45 years, in 2020, in May, June 2020, we saw skirmishes which led to the death of at least 20 Indian soldiers and sort of undefined number of Chinese casualties, although China has said only 4 Chinese were killed, but Indian military maintains that many more Chinese soldiers were killed in the conflict. But the fact is that every death is a tragedy. And the trust which was expressed in the form of maintaining the peace and tranquility on the border, and which was part of bilateral agreements between India and China, going back to 1993, that peace and tranquility on the border has to be maintained. And by engaging in violent conflict in 2020, which led to the death of 20 Indian soldiers, I think that trust, whatever trust existed between these two countries, that has been broken. And it'll be difficult to earn the trust. It takes a long time to earn the trust. It is much easier to breach it.
Now, it's clear that China's economic and military might is far, far ahead of India. But we know from recent conflicts that when it comes to boots on the ground, it is the direct combat experience that counts. And the last time China had that direct combat experience was 40 years or so ago. So would that make a difference if a war breaks out between China and India?
Well, first of all, there is clearly a major gap between China's just simply defense budget. China's defense budget is even the publicly announced defense budget, because remember, China's data are a bit rubbery. Most defense analysts agree that China's defense budget is actually higher, much higher than what is publicly disclosed, during National People's Congress sessions. But even judging by publicly declared Chinese defense spending is more than 4 times that of India's defense spending. China also has a much stronger industrial base. Its manufacturing capability is much stronger than India's, which has been developed over the last 45 years. China has been able to get access to, advanced technology from Europe, from Japan, from the United States. So it has been able to build up a strong military industrial complex, from building, fighter aircrafts to tanks to all kinds of missiles. China is now even building, wide-bodied aircraft, passenger aircraft. So China has developed a very strong indigenous military capability. And that is important. Whereas, India is still the world's largest importer of military hardware. China is becoming one of the more emerging exporters of military technology. So there is asymmetry.
We know that. Sorry, but we know from our experience in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and Iraq, when the war breaks out, it doesn't matter, how sophisticated your equipment is, what your military might is, and so on. What happens on the ground is completely different, right? I mean, considering the one child policy in China, would there be fire in the belly of the Chinese soldiers to stand and fight, as would an Indian soldier do?
I personally, I don't think, clearly, as I said, there is asymmetry between Indian and Chinese military power. So there is asymmetry. But it is also true that on the line of actual control, the border, the de facto border between China and India, there is a fairly good balance of power, I think. I think India has, over the last 20, 25 years, has been building its own infrastructure on the border. That has been accelerated during Prime Minister Modi's term in office over the last 10 years. So India has been building up its own infrastructure on the border. Indian army is in many ways more experienced in mountain warfare than the Chinese military. Indian army has more practical experience in mountain warfare. And after all, Indian military has held the Siachen Glacier for a long time. And it's not an easy task to actually to operate at such a high altitude. So Indian military certainly is a force to contend with, but and a military also needs timely supplies of military hardware and other logistics. So logistics infrastructure has improved. So as far as the border is concerned, I'm not too worried about India's ability to handle China on the border. But overall, particularly when it comes to maritime competition, we know that China has been building maritime infrastructure, dual use infrastructure, all around the Indian Ocean, all around India's neighborhood. And any war between China and India, any future war, is unlikely to remain a land war, unlikely to remain just a border war, unlike in the past. Any future war is likely to be, fought both on land and on the sea. So maritime capabilities of China have also grown rapidly. India has now begun to pay more attention to the Navy, but Indian Navy for a long time has received a second-class treatment compared to the Army. But Indian Navy is now developing. India is now building more ships and submarines, acquiring more submarines. So India's naval capabilities are growing. But when we look at the overall balance of power has to include not just the soldiers, boots on the ground, as you say, on the border. We have to look at all three branches of the military. That is, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And there, I think we do have a gap, and India needs to focus on, as I said, building its economy so that it has the capacity to.
Okay, thank you. Let's start with Pakistan. Is it fair to describe Pakistan as the snake in the backyard, dancing to the tune of China?
Pakistan has been a problem for India since the partition. It was a problem in the sense that it led to 3 wars. If you don't include Kargil in 1999, 3 full-scale wars were fought between India and Pakistan. But I think Pakistan now has its own problems. So personally, I see China as a real challenge for India. I see Pakistan more as a nuisance. So Pakistan's economy is in a bad shape. Pakistan is dependent on economic aid, loans from countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and wherever else it can get access to funds from. So I personally think that although Pakistan will remain, will continue to pose a problem for India, but India's long-term challenge is China, not Pakistan. It's a country which hasn't been able to consolidate its nationhood, nationalism. All post-colonial societies tend to have a top-down form of nationalism, where the top leadership tries to build a narrative, a nationalist narrative. And Pakistan has tried to do that, going back to the founding of Pakistan, going back to the partition of India. But I don't think Pakistan has succeeded in building a modern nation state which is built on a strong, origin story, on a strong national story. So nationalism remains a relatively weak ideology in Pakistan. And Pakistan has had too many internal problems. The The fact that Punjab province has dominated Pakistan's military and government for so long, it doesn't go down very well with other provinces, Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or Sindh, for example. So Pakistan is still a work in progress in terms of nationhood. Its economy has not been able to keep pace with India's economy, let alone China's economy. China's economy, of course, is far surpassed. They have become too dependent on foreign powers for their own internal development. And you cannot really become a significant power simply having nuclear weapons, because remember, nuclear weapons are not particularly useful in regular conflicts. Nuclear use of nuclear weapons, any power that threatens to use nuclear weapons is kidding itself, because in this day and age the use of nuclear weapons is frowned upon by every country, and Pakistan's nuclear weapons are not going to be much help in terms of managing relations with India. What will help Pakistan is Pakistan developing a solid economic base, which will give Pakistan confidence. And in fact, a confident Pakistan, which is growing well, which has happy, prosperous population, would be in the interest of India, because it will be much easier to negotiate with a confident, prosperous Pakistan than a Pakistan which is very insecure, which is finding it difficult to meet the basic needs of its own people. So Pakistan's weakness, both economic weakness and weakness as a nation state, is a problem for India. But I don't think Pakistan is India's greatest challenge. China is.
Okay. And I think that is reflected in the recent movement of Indian troops from, I think, the Pakistani border to Chinese border. Now, what about the other neighboring countries? The Modi government has assiduously followed this neighborhood first policy. He even at his 2014 inauguration, he invited all the SAARC leaders. There have been some positive movements there and some negative movements, for example, Maldives. So what's your overall assessment of India's neighborhood first policy?
No, I'm very supportive of Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy. I think India needed to strengthen its relations with its neighborhood. And India has shown over the last decade in particular that India has been generous. For example, when Sri Lanka faced an economic emergency, India was in fact the only country which came forward with nearly $4 billion in economic assistance to Sri Lanka. India has also been generous with Bangladesh and, of course, the smaller Indian Ocean states. So neighborhood first policy has sent a very clear signal that India wants to maintain good relations with its neighbors. And remember, there is a huge difference in terms of size and scale between India and its neighborhood. India is by far the biggest country in terms of population, in terms of economy, in terms of its military. So it's always going to be difficult for India to convince its smaller neighbors that India means well, that there is no need to fear India, that there is no need to worry about India, that India is here to help you. These countries are always going to be apprehensive about India's growing power, because they will see the asymmetry between India and their own position in the international system. And no amount of persuasion, no amount of economic assistance or loans is going to persuade these countries, India's neighbors, to essentially lock in their fate with India. It's going to be difficult. Okay. We can see even China. China has failed in Southeast Asia. China's economy is now 5 times the size of India's economy. But Southeast Asian countries, the majority of ASEAN states, with the exception of Cambodia or Laos, much smaller countries, most of the countries in Southeast Asia are still very apprehensive of China. And India's South Asian neighbors, India's Indian Ocean neighbors, will remain apprehensive of India. But that doesn't mean that India should give up on its attempts to strengthen its relationship with its neighbors. India does cast a long shadow over South Asia. There is no doubt about it. It's just too big. It casts a long shadow. But India has to be mindful of the fact that India's neighbors also have agency. They exercise their own agency. They are, after all, sovereign states, and they make their own foreign policy decision. And what we have seen in India's neighborhood is that, in countries that are democracies, such as Sri Lanka, such as Maldives, uh, these countries have a polarized political climate where one party becomes pro India, another party becomes anti India or becomes critical of India. And they want to differentiate themselves. And every political party has to be able to persuade voters to vote for them. And India has become the polarizing sort of object in many of these countries. We've seen that in Sri Lanka, and definitely we saw that in the Maldives election, that India bashing can be beneficial for some political parties. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. But that's I think that's bound to happen, because after all, these are sovereign states, and their politicians and their leaders will exercise their agency to maximize advantage, to maximize political advantage, but when they are in government, to maximize national advantage. For example, there's no harm in Sri Lanka or Maldives taking money, taking assistance from both China and India. Why wouldn't they? If they were in that position where they can actually sit on the fence and say that, okay, we are not pro-India or pro-China. We are not anti-India or anti-China. We're simply pursuing our own national interests. And whoever is willing to give us investment, aid, we will take it. So they're exercising their agency. So I think India needs to have a better study of India's neighborhood. We need Indian universities, Indian think tanks to study India's neighbors, society, politics much more carefully, so that India has a better policy towards its neighborhood. Simply, economic assistance or assurances are not going to be enough. We need to demonstrate, we need to strengthen people-to-people ties between India and its neighbor. We also need to resist the temptation to show a cultural superiority, that that you owe it to us. It is our culture which influences your culture. We need to resist that temptation to try and convince our neighbors that we are the font of all cultural wisdom, because each state has its own history, its own origin story, and they're quite proud of that. So while I think India will remain a powerful influence on India's neighborhood, largely because of geographical proximity, but also as a matter of policy, that India is now saying that, look, we want better ties, we want closer ties. And India is the first responder when it comes to any natural disaster in South Asia. Who do these countries turn to when there's a natural disaster, when there's a cyclone, when there is a tsunami, or when there's an earthquake? India is the first country to respond. So, India is the neighbor, and India does have a natural advantage over China or any other country. But we also have to be mindful that self-respect is important to any state and to the people of any state. As long as we are mindful of that, I think India should continue to be generous, and India will continue to have bigger influence.
Okay. Let's just zoom out to the world stage again and conclude. Um, the Indian government has taken a lot of initiatives. There is also hug diplomacy that Modi government is famous for. Plus, there are some initiatives such as climate change accord, vaccine diplomacy, leader of the global south, and so on. So do you think slowly but steadily the world is seeing India as a Vishwamitra?
Well, you remember that when Modi government first came to power, the narrative, until recently, in fact, until last year, the narrative was Vishwaguru, that we are going to be the Vishwaguru, that we had so much to offer in terms of wisdom, intelligence, our contribution to science and everything. India was going to be the Vishwaguru. And of course, when you translate that word Vishwaguru, that is something which is not acceptable to others. No state wants to accept somebody else, another state, as a guru to them. And I think it is correct the way India has now reformulated its approach to the word. It's still using Indian, history and Indian culture and Sanskrit terminology. Vishwamitra sounds much better than Vishwaguru. Vishwamitra meaning India wants to be friend to all. India is a friend of everyone. Any other country, any other state that wants to be, friendly towards India, India will reciprocate in a positive way. That India wants to be a friend, because remember, the relationship between friends is not patronizing. It is not condescending. It is not a power relationship. Vishwamitra goes much better than Vishwaguru, because Vishwaguru means that there is a one-way transfer, that the guru is somehow transferring something, knowledge and wisdom, to the chela, to the shishya. Nobody wants to be a shishya in international system. Nobody wants to be a pupil. But Vishwamitra, I think, is a much more positive terminology, much more positive phrase to use in international relations, that although it does have its origins in Indian culture and Indian history, but it is a relationship of equal. And remember that in the international system, regardless of your size, states are supposed to be equal. At least in theoretical construct, all states are supposed to be equal, and they deserve equal respect. And Vishwaguru doesn't create any Vishwamitra doesn't create any
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, and finally, from snake charmer to IT services to the landing of Chandrayaan-3, India has come a long way in the eyes of the world. In your experience, how is it going to shape up in the next 10 or 20 years?
I think if India remains focused on economic development, building world-class infrastructure, building a world-class industrial base, clearly understanding what India's strengths are, and with government policy support, cultivating those strengths, developing world-class manufacturing industry, would lead to India deserving and being given the respect that India, as the most populous country in the world, clearly should have. India has talent. India has educational institutions which churn out thousands of engineers, tens of thousands, in fact, of engineers, scientists, economists, accountants, you name it. And India is capable of producing world-class talent. And Indian talent is also welcome all over the world because Indian talent assimilates much faster than talent from many other countries, largely because of India's open culture, India's open political system, because of India's history as a country at the crossroads of international exchange. So Indian talent generally does well. English language is also a factor, of course. The fact that most of India's engineers and doctors and other professionals are fluent in English and are able to operate in different parts of the world fairly easily, that also helps. It may be a colonial heritage, but it certainly does India no harm. It certainly gives India an advantage on international stage, on the world stage. So I think India's got everything going for it. India has got a favorable international climate. It's got one of the fastest growing, economies in the world. It has a young population, a youthful population, who is very aspirational. India's youth is very keen to do well. They're very keen to learn. They're very keen to, invest in, studies and work hard. They're also very open. They're very open in terms of, learning different things. And so I think everything is going for India. International climate is in India's favor. The world economy is no longer just about manufacturing. The global economy is now as much about artificial intelligence and, robotics and computers than manufacturing. Manufacturing remains important. But India is in a position now where if it plays its cards right, India should continue to grow at, the current rate of 7.4%. It could be accelerated even to 8 or 9%. And if India can maintain that growth rate over the next 15, 20 years, then I think there's no doubt that India will be one of the biggest economies in the world. India will have a much higher standard of living. India's infrastructure will be in a much better position. So overall, the outlook of India is very positive. And I don't think it is just because of any one leader or any one government. I think India is in the right spot now. And even if there were to be a change of government, as I've said, it's unlikely that this year's elections will lead to a change. But even if there were a change, I think India is set up quite well to continue to grow, short of any major global upheaval, short of a large-scale conflict, which of course India would not be spared from if there's a war involving major powers. And that's why it's in India's interest. And I think India's foreign policy is geared towards avoiding a major conflict, because a major conflict on the world scale is going to be harmful to India. Otherwise, India has got everything going for it, and it should avoid a major conflict.
So as we say in management, it is in the strategic sweet spot.
It is in a good spot. Moment. It's in a good spot.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Pradeep. Really appreciate your participation and particularly insights on China. You're a China expert, and so that would be really well appreciated. Thank you so much.
No problem. Loved it. Thanks, Mo.